Yeah, my name is Sarah Davis. I'm a master's philosophy student at this point, past engineer and science artist, just generally interested in how the world works. Michael?
Yeah, I'm Mike Levin. I'm a professor in the biology department at Tufts University. I run the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts, and I'm also a associate faculty at the Wyss Institute at Harvard.
The most interesting kind of through line for me in all of Michael's work that I've looked at is this connection, or this maybe tension, I don't know, the way the morphology plays with electricity. Just, yeah, which one's in the driver's seat, or some kind of like understanding of how those two work together. No, I feel like that is going to kind of happen down the road, that particular focus. So please, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to preface this by saying that, and maybe this is obvious, but I just want to say that all of this is very much a work in progress. So I'm going to tell you what I think about these things, but I certainly am not claiming that this is all worked out, or that I'm not going to change my mind at some point, or you know, that this is not going to develop in some fashion. This is under you know, constant work. So I think the fundamentals of all this are simply that there are multiple interpenetrating systems at different scales that are all present simultaneously, all of which can be profitably looked at as individuals. And so this diagram here sort of, it looks like all it's saying is the mere sort of fact of physical structure. That if you look, you see organisms, and within that you got organs and cells. So that's not that's sort of not the whole point of this. The point isn't merely that they're arranged this way, but that you've got subunits, and those subunits have themselves subunits, all of which are selves. And what I mean by them being selves, and it's the central claim of the paper, is that they are to some extent, so not binary, but on a continuum of agency, they are to some extent goal directed agents. So they're trying to achieve certain aims. And so when I say that they're nested, all of this simply means that you can have systems where the different parts are all actively trying to achieve various things in their own spaces. And we should talk about that. That's an important part that developed since this paper was written, is this idea of different action spaces that these things are working in. But they're nested in the sense that I think just because a higher level system acquires a goal or is pursuing a goal, that doesn't mean the lower systems aren't doing it. And all of these things are, in fact, simultaneously doing their best to pursue various kinds of goals. So that's what I meant by multiple nested individuals. Yeah, so the scaling and the relationship between layers is, of course, one of the most interesting things here. So one of the things we are currently trying to do, both experimentally and with modeling, is to really show some very tight examples, because this paper was largely qualitative, but we're now trying to show some very specific examples where we can actually track the scaling. So you have lower level subunits. So let's say you have cells that have only local metabolic goals, so all they know how to do is pursue some energy level in a kind of homeostasis to stay alive. And so the question is, how do you connect those in a way that is then going to give rise to a larger agent that has much larger scale goals, that can be working towards a state of affairs, and to be actually stressed by the failure to reach a state of affairs that is way bigger than any individual cell. And so I'm not sure that there's any kind of conservation here, in the sense that there's only a total amount that you sort of have to partition it among the levels, and that's all that there is. I'm not sure that's, yeah, I would make that claim. I think that the total amount of individuality can change over time, and it can rise and fall. And in fact, the boundaries between the different agents can grow and shrink. That was a significant part of the paper, talked about that. And there's a couple of interesting things that get passed upwards, so to speak. Definitely a kind of coarse graining, in the sense that if you are a system whose parts are themselves competent in getting various things done despite changing conditions and so on, they're not just the hardwired mechanisms, but actually competent to pursue specific outcomes despite perturbations. What it means is that the larger system is now working in a much easier space, in the sense that if it doesn't have to micromanage all the microstates that the individual pieces are doing, but it can rely on those components to get their job done, then what you're really working in is a much lower dimensional, simpler space, where problem solving gets easier. And just as a simple biological example, we now know that, for example, in the tadpole, if you activate a signal that triggers, it happens to be a bioelectric signal that triggers eye formation in another part of the embryo, let's say on the tail, then all kinds of interesting things will happen. It will build an eye. It will recruit cells that you never directly manipulated. So it's a local self-organization process. That eye will form even though it's sitting in the middle of muscle instead of in the brain where it belongs. All of these things are going to happen anyway. If you're the larger, and by the way, those tadpoles can then see out of that eye, even though it's on the tail instead of in the head. So if you are a system that needs to solve some problems in terms of I've got some eyes and I need to do this behavior that I'm doing and so on, if you don't have to micromanage all of those components and saying each cell of that eye, where exactly it's going to go, what exactly it's going to attach to, and so on, if there is an effector that you have access to, an affordance maybe, that says build an eye, and you as a larger system don't need to know how that's going to happen. You can just trust that is going to happen under a wide range of conditions. You have a much simpler space to work in. And the problem solving, that's one of the things we're doing now, is trying to map out some of the different spaces in which all these different agents are actually solving problems, and trying to define what that means. So one of the things that gets passed up is this coarse grading because of the lower level competency. So that's I think a key thing, and maybe we'll get to talking about what that does for evolution, because I think it's massively important.
I don't have unfortunately, they've changed the interface, so I don't know where the hand is anymore in this. But one question that keeps coming up for me in all the different realms of discussion about this is, like, well, in particular with the bioelectricity part, you use the word subroutines when you were talking about, we think we're starting to understand the whatever combinatorics of how this works, and also related to these nested levels and things like this. I just keep wondering if it's your sense from all of this work that you've done that in nature, in the communication between these levels, that there's any amount of abstraction or semantic layer that's needed for that to happen between levels, and also with the electricity, like subroutine implies that there's some kind of semantics that something has to rest on. And that just keeps coming back to me. Do you have any sense about that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one thing about bioelectricity is that bioelectricity, I think, is interesting not because it's in some sense magical, or there's something sort of uniquely better about bioelectricity than biomechanical or biochemical modes of interaction. What I think is really interesting about bioelectricity is that is what is being used, and perhaps these other modes too are too. We don't know, but bioelectricity for sure is being used as the computational medium by which the lower levels bind together into the higher level cognition. So the higher systems cognition, whatever level it may have. So what the bioelectricity allows us to do is to directly peek into that computation. And so I think that's why it's interesting, which is no surprise. I mean, that's exactly when people do neural decoding, that's exactly what they hope, right? Is that by tracking the bioelectricity, they learn something about the information content of the global system, right? What is the animal or the human thinking about? And so it's exactly the same here. So that's what's unique about bioelectricity. And I think that what evolution discovered very early on is that, and then it capitalized on that by pivoting it into neural kinds of systems, and we do it in our computational devices and so on, is that what evolution found really, really early is around the time of bacterial biofilms, actually, is that electricity is a great way to process information, to integrate information across distance, and to do computations, right? And that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. So I don't know if I would claim that it has, any kind of a formal syntax at these levels or anything like that. But what it definitely does do is a kind of, when I say subroutine, what I'm mostly leaning on is this idea of modularity, but not just modularity in form, because that's been discussed a lot in evolutionary developmental biology, but actually modularity of function. So the key, the thing about a good subroutine is that you're going to, when you activate the subroutine, you can move along and assume that everything that's necessary to get that job done, given whatever local conditions or current events or whatever else is happening, that subroutine is going to encapsulate everything that's needed to get it done. Meaning it's not just, it's the difference. So for people who code, it's the difference between sort of macro substitution, where all you're doing is just, it's a shorthand for a bunch of hardwired steps and just plopping that in. I don't think that's the magic here at all. I think what it is it's a degree of competency in that subroutine to get something accomplished. And that has really, really important implications for evolvability and so on. And what the bioelectricity allows you to do is to basically to have a language in which the system can call out such circuits with specific behaviors at different points or at different times. And that makes it really really powerful. But the question of whether it has any kind of formal syntax or anything like that, I don't have good evidence for that.
I don't even mean like a formal syntax. It's almost like and this also holds true between these nested layers of organismal whatever. Is if you have a sense that there's any abstraction layer needed. And I guess you kind of answered it maybe by saying that electricity is this medium on which things communicate. But yeah, anyway, I don't think it's an easy. It's like easy to answer question, but that's the theme that keeps coming back to me. So
I think there's a lot of abstraction in the sense of, and I don't know if this captures what you're asking, but there's a lot of abstraction in the sense of generalization, in terms of another way to say it is coarse grain. I mean, voltage itself. Let's just start with that. Voltage itself is an abstraction for cells and in fact, people will often ask if I say there's a bioelectrical signal. They say, well, is it the potassium level? Is it the sodium level? Like what, is it the particular ion channel gene? And
is it the voltage or is it the current? Yeah.
Yeah, and in particular, so the cool thing about bioelectrics is that with that question has been answered, and we know the answer. It's neither of those things. So it's a pattern of voltage that is specific for the downstream effects. And it doesn't matter how, with very rare exceptions, it doesn't matter how you got to that voltage. So you can use sodium channels, you can use potassium channels, chloride, what ion you used, all those micro details don't matter at all, because what the collective is keying off of is the spatiotemporal distribution of voltage. And you can get exactly the same results with sodium or potassium or chloride, as long as you're driving the right voltage patterns. So voltage itself is a really cool abstraction, because it means that all the underlying mechanisms are free to diverge in evolution. You want to swap out a potassium channel for a sodium channel, you can do that as long as you've got the right functional properties, so that your overall pattern stays. And we use that quite often in our regenerative medicine applications. It's a really convenient property. So the bioelectric code itself is definitely an abstraction over what the microstates in terms of specific ions or the specific channel genes that got you there.
Yes, hello. Hi there. Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I was curious. We had a really interesting. Chris Field gave us a really good insight into the quantum contextuality idea of how things could build up from different sort of space states at very small levels. And active inference often uses non-equilibrium steady state attractors as kind of a way to look at some sort of statistics between the scales. You know, there's some sort of flux or flow that's inferred. And I find it really useful thinking about it with this cone idea that you bring to the table, because there's more of an idea of a distinct swarming going into a structure and some sort of system that might emerge from that, which is sometimes lost when it's very much in the math. And I'm curious whether, when you think about these, the bioelectric effects, and the same sort of question came up with quantum contextuality, maybe, is there more of a distinct scale at which there's a coherence? You know, like you got the cell membrane, then you've got a coherence around which the bioelectrics can operate, so to speak, and then you might have another distinct level at which the bioelectrics can operate, which is maybe more than the more gradated idea of steady state statistical sort of manifolds. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about how and where there's sort of scales at which the bioelectrics become particularly coherent, or if that even happens.
Yeah, I mean, so again, prefacing this by saying that the bioelectrics is not an essential part of the story, except insofar as I think morphogenesis is a nice example of an unconventional agent within which to play with these kind of ideas. You know, so what I would like to do, and this is a framework that I've been developing recently, is to get away from the standard sorts of living creatures that we're used to, right? So the products of that one trace of evolution in the biosphere on Earth, and to go beyond that and to look at the space of possible agents, the space of possible bodies, and the space of possible minds that those bodies will support, and think more broadly. So in doing that, what I think the bioelectrics in I think that morphogenesis is a nice example of an unconventional agent that lets us see how the framework is to be practically applied. Right, so people say, okay, this is all well and good, but what use is it? And I say, okay, let's apply it to a specific thing that really no one thinks of as a cognitive agent, and I'm going to show you how all this stuff maps and why it's useful at the bench, and it helps do new experiments and so on. So if we accept that morphogenesis is kind of a test case for, and there are many others, it's certainly not unique, but it's a test case for an unconventional place to find agency and all of that, and to test out how well this theory helps us out. Then what's cool about bioelectricity is that it actually allows us to tell a very specific, mechanistic, testable, empirically useful story about how the information flow happens and how the levels scale. But it's just one, it's just that's just happens to be how the morphogenetic self does things, and there are plenty of other interesting selves that wouldn't have anything to do with bioelectricity. So I just want to make that clear, right? That bioelectricity is not some sort of essential element that's always going to be present whenever we apply these things. It just it's central to the example case that I've trotted out, which is morphogenesis. Now, having said that, bioelectricity is definitely multi-scale, because you have bioelectric dynamics in organelles on a very small scale. You have the resting potential across the cell membrane, which is mainly what we study. But those scale into tissues, and you have global electrical fields, which are driven by transepithelial potentials on the scale of tissues and organs, which other people like Minzhou and many other people study. And then past that, you have whole animal scale, like whole body scale fields as well. So all of these different levels, exist. Some of them more and some less rely on bioelectricity, but it's relevant in this particular unconventional agent. It's relevant to all the scales that we know.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks. And would you say that the cone concept could be extrapolated to other types of multi-scale crystal blanket type ideas? And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that, or whether that just confuses things to try that. But
no, I don't think it confuses. Now, I'll say I'm for sure not. I mean, I like Carl's ideas very much. I'm by no means an expert on the map, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand all that. But I think that the thing about these kind of diagrams is they're not meant to be unique or exhaustive. So the goal of this originally, this came about a couple of years ago at a Templeton meeting, where we were asked to brainstorm ways to define almost a sort of eigenspace where you're able to compare directly really diverse intelligences, right? So things where you can't just measure all their brains and then see how they shake out. It's really diverse intelligence. And so what I tried to come up with is a scale, and it's all focused around the spatiotemporal scale of the goals that any given agent can work towards, and the scale of states of affairs that can stress out that agent when they're not being met, and so on, as a way to pick on something that I think is central to all agents, no matter what they're made of, no matter how they got here, evolved, designed, combinations, chimeras, whatever, wherever they came from and whatever they are, what is essential to them. And I picked this goal directedness, but this is compatible with all kinds of other systems. So you could overlay on top of this almost anything else that you thought was critical about being an agent. Just start adding dimensions, and absolutely, right now this is compatible with all sorts of things. This is not meant to rule out anybody else's favorite framework. I just think it captures one slice of what's essential about being a self.
Thanks. That's really useful. Actually, can I just one more thing, Blue? I'm actually really interested in this. I do a lot of work with community psychology. So there's this challenge of going from the self. There's like the self, and then there's society, social. But the intersubjective kind of group dynamics there's a big problem, because it's like a big hole. Because this, I find this really useful, because a lot of stuff which talks about how groups, they often try to project out into the future as if it's a light beam that you could measure, whereas here it's much more, like it's sitting in the swarming. I like to think the bottom of the cone is almost the swarming dynamics that go down into the past. You've got the kind of structure of the cell that's emerged, and then the system that's able to go into temporal depth in the future, and the cone. I think that offers a nice way to think about group dynamics, particularly maybe the more ironically the more challenging group dynamics, where there isn't a coherent single narrative. So there might be applications there.
Yeah, this is super interesting, and I should say one of the things about the cone, and we had a discussion about this yesterday, and Pranab Das pointed out that my cone compared to Minkowski's cone is upside down. Right. And the reason I did it this way was because if you think about where any given agent, the only thing the given agent is really certain of at the moment is what's going on right now. So your future obviously is uncertain, and when you're trying to predict, so let's say you're trying to manage goals and you're trying to predict, you've got some predictive capacity going forward. That predictive capacity doesn't get better over time; it gets worse over time, right? You're sort of exponentially more uncertain about what's going to happen later on. So your ability to pursue those goals in the future gets smaller and smaller. Same thing goes back in the past, although you could argue that that's linear and not exponential. But again, what you're doing at any given moment in time is inferring what your past was from the engrams of memory that are available to you. They might be a brain, they might be a stigmergic medium that you live in, within, if you're an ant colony, whatever it's going to be. You've got some kind of material in which you leave, in which events leave memories, they leave traces. At any given moment, you are reading those traces, recalling them, and reconstructing what you think the past was. That's your only evidence for what the past was. Any given moment, you have no idea what actually happened. And so even going backwards, my cone comes down, because your ability to go backwards in time and be certain of what went on, and what are the facts on which you can now build your goal-directed strategy going forward, become more and more uncertain going back. So that's why my cones are upside down in the so to speak, because there's no particular reason this has to map exactly onto Minkowski's formalism, but I think it's close. That just because that your level of certainty is highest right now, right, both in space and time, and when you step away from that, it rapidly, at least for all of us, it rapidly gets smaller. So that's true. That's absolutely true. It's definitely also an information cone. But I want to be clear about this because this diagram is not a diagram of what you can sense or how far your effectors range. This is the what you just said about the information certainty is the consequences of that are that you also have a limited cone in what the diagram really is supposed to show, which is the scale of the goals towards which you can work. So because the information is smaller, your ability to pursue goals towards, how far into the future am I actively, doing it? It just becomes limited, right? Your ability to do so. So it's sort of a secondary consequence of that. But I just want to be clear that this is not meant to be fundamentally a picture of the information certainty, of sensory capacity, of effector range, or anything like that. This is a diagram in goal space.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really interesting point, right? And people talk about great transitions in cognition along the continuum and so on. And so I think one great great transition is the following: if you are a creature with a horizon, with a cognitive horizon of a half an hour, you're a goldfish or something. I don't know if this is factually true, but you're some sort of form that has a cognitive horizon of a half an hour, right? What that means is that all of your major goals, survival and these other things, they're totally achievable, right? Because it is completely plausible that you are going to make it for that half hour that you can project forward. If you are a human and your cognitive horizon, your goals are, I don't know, world peace, or your buildings, the larger things, you are, for the first time, perhaps along the Earth's lineage anyway, you are able to comprehend goals that you have no chance whatsoever of achieving because you have a limited lifespan. So now that's a really sharp transition, kind of an emergent transition, because for the first time you are able to undertake goals that you are not going to complete, guaranteed, right? Whereas the fish has some, maybe you'll get eaten and maybe you won't, but it's totally plausible that that you live for the half hour that you can see forward. Humans have that, and so I suspect that this is, and this is, sort of way above my pay grade to know details about this, but I suspect this drives a lot of the weird facts about human psychology, because you now have this fundamental stressor that other creatures don't have, because you're able to foresee all these goals that you are definitely not going to meet. And that's a novel, sort of a conflict between the different modules that doesn't exist for I think for most other creatures. Definitely. So there's a couple of really interesting things related to that, to evolution that we can talk about, and that's something I'm working on now, and this thing should be done, I don't know, in a couple of weeks, and then we'll see. Two things. Number one, one of the amazing things about biological hardware that's given to us by evolution is that there's a default way. By that I mean cells, but they're genomically determined proteins, whatever they have. There's a default and a pretty robust, consistent default outcome, right? And so embryo, fish embryos make fish, and frog embryos make frogs, and so on. But there's an incredible amount of plasticity there, so that those exact same cells, genetically wild type, so the hardware is all the same, are in fact in other types of environments are able to make completely novel creatures, right? And so some of this, so synthetic biology and synthetic morphology is already showing this. We as our xenobots and things like this, and there'll be tons more going forward. That one thing that's interesting about those novel creatures is that you don't have a long history of specific selection and frozen accidents and all this, phylogenetics to lean on when you ask why do they do certain things, right? So for every normal animal in the biosphere, you say, why is this thing, green, and why does it fly, and how come it has these antennae? The answer is always the same. Well, because for millions of years, the ancestors were selected for this and that. The fact that we can take those embryos, those cells rather, cells from those kind of animals, and put them together into a new creature that has goals and behaviors, morphological goals, behavioral goals, physiological goals, that basically appear overnight, within 24, 48 hours, they sort of show up. And then the question is, where did these things come from? Because what they didn't do was to be honed over millions of years by specific selection pressure. So that's a very interesting to me aspect of the plasticity here, that it is not, the history doesn't necessarily determine them other than the default, sort of variant. And where does that come from? And then there's the whole thing, which, I don't know, you can tell me if you want to dive deeper into this or not, but the whole, the fact that you have multiple layers and that you have competency going down, sort of all the way down, has massive implications for why evolution works so fast, right? Why actually anything is able to evolve on the time scale that we see. So I think, if you're interested, we could get into that. Okay, let's talk about that a little bit. Imagine two kinds of creatures, and you've got one kind of creature where the genome has a pretty direct influence over what the anatomy is going to be. Everything is hardwired in some sense. And so let's visualize. Let's say it's a frog of some kind, and there's the genome, and it makes a frog, and that's what it does. And so now we imagine evolution is sort of searching the space, and now there's a mutation, and the mutation does two things. Because most mutations do multiple things. Let's say we got a mutation that does two things. It moves the eyes off kilter, right? And it also has some really beneficial effect somewhere else. It helps with some other thing. Most mutations are pleiotropic, so it's a reasonable conjecture. If your animal is the hardwired kind, the eyes are in the wrong place, nothing works. The evolution never gets to explore the positive benefits of this other mutation, because the thing's going to be dead. It's just not a workable animal anymore. The fitness is very low. It's gone. And so if you think about these kind of hardwired things, it's the same. When I first, now 100 years ago, when I first heard about how evolutionary algorithms are supposed to work, this idea that I've got a system that does something, I'm going to start throwing random changes in. Right? Anybody that's written any code, are you crazy? Of course, everything's going to get worse, not better. That's never going to work. Now imagine a different. Now, of course, it works, but it takes massive amounts of time, and there's all these difficulties about evolving complex things. Now imagine what we actually have. The actual, and I'll explain the biological example of this. When you have a tadpole, and the tadpole has to move all of its organs, craniofacial organs, around to become a frog. So the jaws have to come out, the nostrils move, the eyes move forward, like everything, all this stuff moves around. And you could have a hardwired animal in which every organ moves in the right direction, a particular a distance, and that's it, right? And that's your hardwired thing. that actually is not what how animals work. So what we did a few years ago is we made what we call these Picasso tadpoles. The idea is you make these tadpoles, everything's in the wrong place. The eyes are on the back of the head, the mouth is off to the side, the nostrils are up here, like it's just scrambled, like Mr. Potato Head, everything's scrambled. So if it was a hardwired system, then all of these things would move the traditional amount in the traditional direction, and everything would be way off because you're starting in the wrong spot. Instead, what happens is that all of these organs move in novel paths, and they keep moving, and sometimes they overshoot and have to come back, but they keep moving until they build a correct frog face, and then they stop moving. So now that system, so what the genetics actually gives you, it doesn't somehow give you a hardwired set of movements. What it does do is give you an error minimization scheme that can progressively deform the system until the error from some sort of set point, and we've been studying what the set point is, and we can talk about that, until the error from that set point gets to an acceptably low level. So what you have here is a competent set of craniofacial organs that are going to move around and get to where they need to go, even if they start off in the wrong position. So now look at what happens with evolution, right? You got your mutation, the eyes and the jaws now are off in the wrong place, but now you've got this benefit somewhere else. The thing is, the eyes and the jaws are going to get fixed. You don't need to worry about that because they know where they belong. They're going to get there even though they start out in the wrong position. So that negative aspect of that mutation gets hidden from selection for a while anyway, because and eventually it'll canalize into the genome itself. But for a while, it gets hidden from selection, allowing evolution to explore the benefits of the other benefits of that mutation. So here's all in summary. Here's what this means: the fact that you have competent subunits, and they're competent morphologically, they're competent physiologically. We can talk about what that means. The fact that they're all competent means that the fitness landscape is much less rugged. It's much smoother. It means that the effects of mutations are much more linear, meaning that you can examine each consequence independently, because the other consequences can be masked by things. By the local environment being off, it doesn't matter. Things still get where they need to go and connect and so on. So it makes the search process way more easier by allowing you to, and it gives you patience. It means that evolution doesn't have to solve every problem at once. You don't have to wait until you find a mutation that gives you a positive impact and leaves the eyes where they need to be. You don't need to wait for that. If you can grab the first mutation you find that gives you the positive impact, because the eye thing will get taken care of because those subunits are competent. So it raises the IQ of the whole system. The search becomes a much smarter search. It has some patience. It's able to see linearly instead of sort of highly mixed up all of the consequences of these mutations, and it smooths the fitness landscape. So I think when you can count on your components to do some of the heavy lifting, you don't have to micromanage all of it. The evolutionary search gets massively more efficient, and now it starts to become a little more plausible that we actually see this amazing biosphere actually evolved by a process of random mutation. Yeah, I hesitate to say too much because I don't think much is known there that I can say definitively. I think that this whole issue of random and non-random mutations is very controversial. Obviously, I suspect that there is a notion of evolutionary search that's not quite blind. So people often will argue, most people nowadays say evolution is completely blind. It makes these mutations, and whatever happens is not because of any directionality in the search space, and then you have people who think that it's directed towards some specific outcome. I think there's a sort of in between scenario where it's definitely not directed in the sense that it can see far forward in the search space, but it doesn't have to be completely blind in that maybe what it has, and this comes out of some discussions I've had with both Chris Fields and Richard Watson, that maybe instead of a point in fitness space, what you really have is a little bit of a vector. You have almost like a comet trail, right? And then it gives you a little bit of information about direction and about, you know, and you can imagine, I mean, I can sort of design in my head an epigenetic system of marking things on the DNA that give you a little bit about information. Well, what was this allele last time, right? So that you can sort of say, well, I've been turning this knob in this direction and things are going well, so maybe I want to turn it some more. That kind of thing. And this is totally made up. I'm not saying that we know that biology actually does this. It's just maybe it doesn't, and maybe synthetic biology, maybe we implement this on, you know, just for the first time we engineer it. But I think it's possible to make a system that does that. And maybe collections of genes and some of the complex chromatin epigenetics that go on, maybe they're part of that process. But this is total conjecture at this point. Yeah, and so one of the things that we had talked about, and that I'm going to write after this next thing is out, is really on this idea that maybe the whole evolutionary lineage of a particular the animal or plant or whatever it is, maybe that's an agent as well, just stretched out massively over space, such that at any given point in time, all of the existing examples of that species are in fact hypotheses about the space, right? And that what you're doing is you're constantly generating genomes as hypotheses, and some of those genomes are, you know, proven to be, some of those hypotheses are proven good and some are not. And then the next, you know, sort of the next set of genomes is not completely random, but it's in some way part of the active inference of this giant sort of, you know, virtual agent, right? So I think there's a story to be told like that, but it's way more hand-waving than details at this point.
Yeah, my comment is now maybe a little bit stale, but I think I'll put it out there anyway, just for the sake of saying something concrete, because a lot of this feels a bit abstract. Like, and I'm hoping I'm even remembering this anecdote right, but I remember learning that some gene once upon a time that gave us an extra rod or cone in our eye, allowed us better color reception, also was the same gene that shut off our ability to make our own vitamin C. And if that's correct, if I'm remembering that correct, that's such an interesting example of yeah, of course it's an example of the fact that genes do multiple things, but it was kind of like, isn't that coincidental, you know, that this that gene is doing, you know, both something for the eye, but then also making it so that you can get your own vitamin C, you know, by looking at fruit. And I just thought that kept coming to me as an example of what you guys are talking about. But it's stale, sort of.
Yeah, sort of following on. So it's this. You have this idea of like a goal space or a teleological space in a way. That's really interesting. And then with that exploit or explore, I wonder if there's a time when there's a thought about when things are very directed. And of course, our Western thinking, we tend to think about a nice pointed cone. Where we go into the future, and because we sculpt the world around us, and we maybe have like a distinctive trajectory, because we're constructing our world more and more, which is probably part of our problem, to make it the way we want it to be. Whereas, particularly if you look at indigenous cultures, they would have, you know, the more cyclical approach, which would go through 7 generations or different levels of generations, and would be attuning to the environment. And I'm kind of curious whether, and again, this might be where we don't really know, but is there a point at which there's generally trying to come back or maintain in the allostasis the cyclical sort of pattern that is where we want to go to? And is there a time when it's like, okay, we're branching out now, like we've made a jump and we're going to try and inscribe our environment at different scales from the body out to now maintain some new kind of steady state attractor, and how that might fit with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in that some future version of this is going to have to be able to deal with goals that are not only not static, meaning they're cyclical, but also goals that are themselves, let's say second order goals. Like my goal is it's a derivative. My goal is to get better at something. It's not a particular level that I'm looking for, but I want a particular slope of some variable being, a particular, right? So something like that. So you're absolutely right. I started out with the simplest, this is sort of the hydrogen atom of this thing. So I started out with something very simple, that it's homeostatic, as in your goal is to achieve a particular region in whatever space you're solving problems in, be that morphospace or physiological space. Your goal is to find that region and sit there. And that, of course, is not all there is to life. Obviously, that's just the first, kind of step. I just did that for simplicity because I didn't want to tackle everything at once, and there needs to be a lot done here before we get to that point. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Your goal state in that space may not be a point. It may be some interesting, bigger shape. And this thing, and I just I wanted to say something about these goal spaces because I think it's interesting to point this out. So. One of the this all came out of a meeting on diverse intelligences, and so one thing I've been thinking about is what is intelligence, and what are these agents actually trying to do? And okay, so we have lots of examples of problem solving in three-dimensional space, right? So you've got crows and monkeys and everything else, and they're running around and trying to solve problems by moving around in three-dimensional space. But all the different subunits of bodies are solving problems in other kind of spaces. So we talked about morphospace. So if you are an eye in the head of a frog, you are working in a space of possible configurations of where you are relative to everything else, and you are trying to move and act in a way that is going to acquire to a particular region of morphospace that describes that the correct frog head. That's where you're trying to land. There's also a physiological space. So I'll just give you a simple example of this that we found recently. So these flatworms, these planaria, you take these planaria and you throw them in barium. Okay, so a solution of barium. Now, what happens is the barium is a non-selective potassium channel blocker. It blocks all the potassium channels. All the cells freak out. Their heads literally explode. Right, overnight, their heads just degenerate. They're gone. If you take those planaria and you leave them in fresh barium over the next 10, 20 days, what they will do is they will build new heads that are completely barium insensitive. Couldn't care less. No problem at all. They live in barium just fine. So we asked the simple question, and not because the answer has to be this, but just because that's the tool that was available. We asked the simple question: what is transcriptionally different about barium adapted heads from normal heads? Right. So what genes are differently expressed in these heads? And so what you find out is that out of tens of thousands of genes that these planaria have, they manage to regulate a very small number, on the order of a couple dozen, that allow them now to do their business despite the fact that potassium is no longer usable for them. So now this is incredible, because think about the problem that they're solving. And in my head, I always visualize like one of those nuclear reactor control rooms with buttons everywhere. So each button is a different gene. What are you going to do? You have a physiological stressor. You can't pass potassium. Everything's going to heck. You have some tens of thousands of genes that you could turn on and off. The combinatorics are astronomical. You don't have time to try them all. You don't even have time for gradient descent. You don't reproduce fast enough. It's not like bacteria where you could say, well, they're all random and then somebody will survive and repopulate ahead. They don't divide that fast. So you don't have time for any kind of evolutionary explanation. Within some small number of days, you have to home in on a small number of genes, knowing that if you just start randomly flipping them up and down, you're going to make things worse long before you make them better. You're going to kill everything off. You just randomly start. So now the other important fact about this is that planaria never see barium in the wild. So planaria, there's no evolutionary history of being good at surviving in barium because they don't see barium. So now, to me, this is an amazing example of problem solving in a high dimensional virtual space. You've got this a physiological space, and your problem is your problem is physiological. Your effectors are transcriptional largely, although of course you have physiological effectors too. But you're trying to walk in this space, and you have to somehow map. It's unbelievable how they do this. You somehow have to map your effectors in transcriptional space to what's happening to you in physiological space, and then rapidly get to a workable region. So that gives you an idea of what we're talking about, right? These spaces can be transcriptional, physiological, all kinds, and these things, and they solve their problems. And like you pointed out, the thing you're trying to achieve may not be a point. It's certainly not a point in that space, but it may not even be a static area. It may be some sort of, I would like to sort of wander in this, kind of weird loop. That's my goal, right? Is to wander in some sort of weirdly shaped attractor. Yeah, we'll get to that. This is just first step.
Just one question following up from that, just before Sarah. So if I'm right, what you're saying is gradient descent, because that would have to come sort of from where you are and slowly keep incrementing. There's some goal states. I mean, there's some evolutionary history, even if it's not barium, something like barium,
Mm-hmm.
but somehow it's not only going from adjacent possibilities, it's somehow jumping ahead. Is that what you're saying?
So the first thing I'm saying is that I don't have any idea how it works, right? So I am not claiming I have a good model for what's going on here, but I think you're onto something, which is that I think, and I think we talked about this a few minutes ago, which was abstraction and generalization. I think you're exactly right. I think what the system is able to do is to say, okay, I don't know what this barium is, but I've been terribly depolarized before. It was an epileptic, kind of a thing. And this is an awful lot like that. So I'm going to generalize what just happened to this other thing that I do know how to deal with, right? And I'm going to move in that direction. So that's my gut feeling. I don't have a solid model for this, and that's not been proven in any way. But I have a feeling that that's where the answer is going to be. It's going to be that that it's able to do this because it is able to recognize this physiological problem as an instance of a larger class of things for which it does know how to do. And I think that when we talk about intelligence for all of these agents, what we're really saying is it's your ability to navigate these various spaces efficiently and without getting trapped in local minima that kill you, right? Being able to step temporarily, it's that patience, it's that being able to step away from the direct line to your goal to then come around and get. I have a sometimes when I talk about this, I have a picture of this. There's a fence, and there's a couple of dogs on either side of the fence, and they're just like trying to get at each other, right? There's a hole in the fence 4 feet away. So they could do it. The problem is it temporarily requires you to get further from your goal, right? So that ability, you're trapped in this local maximum, and your intelligence is directly sort of proportional to your ability to temporarily get further from your goal in order to actually get into a better position later on. So that's part of the IQ. But I think the other part of the IQ is this kind of generalization, right? And I think you're right. I think that's probably what is going to end up explaining it.
Man, this is great. This question is probably out of bounds, but if you have any thoughts on it, then great. If not, pass. I mean, this the cone type diagram and the agential teleos that it assumes. I'm just wondering if you feel like there's any applicability to non-agential type phenomena, like complex systems or hurricanes or whatever, because when we're talking about abstraction, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about where that could go, if anywhere.
Yeah. So the thing I'll say about that, and this is not this is the kind of thing that's probably not a lot of people will agree with this, but this is my view. To say non-agential presupposes that you can draw a binary sharp line, right? And between things that are agents and things that are not. I don't really believe in that. I think that's a view that gets us into a lot of trouble by looking at looking for these sharp lines. I think that all there is a degree of agency, and I'm not sure we talked about yesterday whether there's such a thing as zero. I'm not even sure there's a zero, but certainly there are things that are very, very sort of very, very low levels of agency, and things that are very high, and everything is a smooth continuum. So now then the question is, okay, so what do you do with hurricanes and things like this? So I drew, and this will be this, in the next paper. There's a thing that I call it's an axis of persuadability. It's sort of related to Dennett's intentional stance in the following way. There's a continuum, and for any given system, so my claim is that it's an empirical problem. You can't say whether something is or is not an agent. Lots of people do. They'll say, "Well, that's not an agent." I think you can't say that until you've done the empirical work. And the empirical work looks like this. All the way, the question is this: as an engineer, so this is very much an engineering perspective. As an engineer, how much work do you have to do? What do you need to know about the system? And what kind of work do you have to do to be able to control and predict its outcome? So I'll just give you a couple of examples. All the way on the left, you have things that are like mechanical clocks. So if you're dealing with a system that's like a mechanical clock, you can put it on the left of this diagram, because you are not going to reason with it, you are not going to train it, you're not going to be able to punish it, you're not going to be able to rewrite its goal states. You have to know how it works, and you have to micromanage the hardware, and you have to make you have to rewire the physics of it to get it to do something else. Okay. Then moving on from that, you have something like a thermostat. And with a thermostat, you're also not going to reason or punish it. But there is a separate set point, and if you want the room to be kept in a different temperature range, you don't have to rewire the thermostat. You can change the set point. So and this has massive implications for regenerative medicine that we can talk about. The way you relate to the system is quite a bit different. Now, after that, you might get to systems that have preferences in the sense that you can actually train them, meaning you can provide rewards and punishments. They will change their behavior, because what you're doing is you're relying on them to be a kind of learning system. They're able to do associative learning, so they associate certain things you've done to them with things that they did, and they will change their behavior. So now this means that we can now think of what this means. Humanity has been training animals for 10,000 years, whatever, with knowing nothing about neuroscience. It means that you don't actually have to know what's going on inside your system. You don't need that micro level hardware information. All you need is to know that animal, that system is actually that it has that level of agency, that it's susceptible to this kind of interaction. And how do you know? You don't know until you've tried. So we have no idea. So one of the things we're doing now with Charles Abramson, who's a behaviorist scientist, we're actually writing a how-to manual, a how-to paper on, if you are given some sort of weird new synthetic system, how do you know where along and there's actually has a bunch of experiments that you do to figure out where you are along this path. So you can go further, and there are other systems where you know nothing about what's inside, and in fact the amount of energy that it takes to manipulate them is tiny, because you can give them reasons as opposed to causes, and you can give them information, and they will act on this information and do various things. And this is, of course, for sophisticated agents. So all that is to say, the question of where something like a hurricane lands on the spectrum, I think we need to really resist the urge to just make pronouncements, sort of armchair pronouncements about that, and we need to ask a simple question: which type of manipulation is that system amenable to? And when you find out, then you know how much agency it has. Now, I'll give you a simple example of how this works. We and other people have done something similar. If you think about gene regulatory networks, so gene regulatory networks are a quintessential example of a dynamical system. It's deterministic and all of that. And one of the things we asked is we simply said, how do we know where on this spectrum it lands? Let's just try to train it and see what happens. And it turns out, so we did this computationally, and now we're sort of starting to do this at the bench. we simply ask the question, could gene regulatory networks have associative learning capacity? And that means that you could do interesting things. You could do Pavlov dogs experiment. So you have a gene regulatory network. You have some stimulus that causes it to do something. So you have your unconditioned stimulus that causes a response. You have this other thing that's a neutral stimulus that normally doesn't do anything. You pair presentations of the UCS and the neutral stimulus together, and after a while, what you might find is that now take away the original unconditioned stimulus and use the neutral stimulus, and that's now enough to trigger the response because there's an associative memory that formed in the network. Right. So now we actually tried this in the sense that we took a bunch of known gene regulatory networks from the literature. We made an algorithm that basically checks for associative learning, and lo and behold, we found two things. We found that there are 6 different kinds of memories that these things can do, including associative memories for many of them, and that the biological networks have way more memories than you find in random networks that you would just randomly concoct. So apparently, either directly or indirectly, selection likes that. So that's just an example of what you would do under this view with dynamical systems, right? That you would think, these are trouble cases. Are they agents or aren't they? I think that's why we get in trouble, because we try to draw a sharp line. I think the answer is there's somewhere on the line. They could be way over on the left or not. And you find out when you figure out what kind of intervention and strategy avails you of the most predictive power with the least amount of effort. Yeah. The biggest so I think one thing that I really need to improve in this whole thing for next time is a better visualization, and I frankly don't yet know how to do it, because this way of visualizing it looks very physical. It looks like what the cone is that the cone is at the edge of the cells that are connected, right? It sort of gives this idea that what you're measuring is the actual physical boundary of the system. And that's not quite what I'm trying to get across, because and this is actually, let's just think about the cells in the cancer versus multicellularity, right? Which is a nice example of how this works. When you have a bunch of cells and they get together and they're going to build a kidney, the size of at least the spatial size of that particular agent is going to be roughly the size of the thing they're working towards. It's going to be the size of that kidney, right? That's the project they're all working on. Each individual cell has no idea what a kidney is, but the collective intelligence of that group of cells, it has a goal. It's trying to build that kidney. If you try to deviate it from that goal, it will do its best to get back and do it anyway. So what you would be measuring there is the size of the state that it's trying to achieve, not necessarily where the edges of the. Now, there's certainly some relationship there, because in this particular example, as you said, what enables the cells to work together is the fact that they're electrically coupled into one and chemically coupled into one giant network. So there's some relationship, but it's not quite always the edge, right? You know what I mean? And the same thing with the individual cells. it's related, but it's not exactly the same thing. When one cell defects, so let's say an oncogene turns on, the cell closes all the gap junctions, disconnects from its neighbors, and now that computational boundary is literally just that one cell. Again, it's not quite at the edge of the cell, because if you look at the scale of things the cell is trying to manage, it's a little bit bigger than that, because it also really cares about some of the, the nutrients, the wastes, the conspecifics, the prey, whatever else is going on right at that edge, right? So it's not quite at the cell boundary. So I just want to make that clear, that this diagram isn't meant to be an anatomical, the cone isn't meant to be a map exactly on the anatomy. It's a cone of the states that the thing is trying to actively manage. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. And as soon as you did that, I realized because that has to, right, those two diagrams eventually have to meet, right? And so there has to be a way to. So I think, I don't know, my visual imagination isn't great. I have to think a little bit more about a better way to kind of represent it. But of course you're right. Those two things have to come together.
Yeah, I was just sort of following on from what you were saying, is often as well, it's useful when we think of entities and processes. I'm maybe scaling up to more psychological scales, but we often think about, this is this person, this is what this entity is diagnosed as, and this entity, and it's all kind of, and there's a lot more now moved towards what's the process, but then what kind of processes do we have on that continuum? Just like we're talking about with the hurricane, you maybe got a static entity like a rock, and then you've got your kind of systems, some of which could be mechanical like a clock, but then you sort of hit structures. There's some sort of structure like a skeleton or a network of processes coming together. And then you get into them, which is what I find really interesting with the work you do, is the sort of non-linear swarming dynamics, and it's sort of, and I was wondering how, when you think of you've got a body, and I'm a body, and I'm trying to work in my space around me. So I see things in my environment out there, and I can interact to some extent depending on what my available processes afford me in my structures. And then there's other stuff inside, which to some extent I kind of have to take care of themselves, unless I want to tattoo myself or do some sort of internal mutilation or something. So I'm curious about how this entity process dynamic going in and out can be thought of.
Yeah. Well, I want to say a couple of things. And again, this is sort of going kind of far astream, but I think it might be relevant. When you say you are this body, sort of in the sense that we are talking to the verbal entity there, but there are all sorts of other entities there that we're not hearing from. And so we know that from split brain patients, right? We know that after a commissurotomy, the right side of the brain, you can communicate with it, and it'll give you opinions that the verbal patient, part of the patient, doesn't agree with, doesn't know anything about, right? So it's really interesting. I also think about multiple personality. They call it multiple personality disorder, but the reality is, a single brain body system apparently can host any number of distinct, and I'm not an expert in this area, so I don't know how psychologically deep so some of these other personalities go, but enough that you can have a conversation, certainly enough that you can have a conversation with them, which means they're doing better than all of the AI that we've ever produced, right? And in fact, I read once, I forget where it was, but there was an interesting comment from a therapist who was asked to, he was asked to deal with a multiple personality patient, and he was talking about integration, and he was, that the goal of the therapy was going to integrate, because of course it's very disruptive for the individual, and we're gonna integrate all of these into one. And one of the personalities said to that patient, "Integration? You're going to kill me, right? That's what you're talking about? I thought you were a doctor. What are we talking about here?" And so, he was outraged that there was going to be this integration of what, at least ostensibly, you've got this entity that certainly passes the Turing test and is not happy about the fact that you're about to integrate it in, away, basically, right? So that's, I think that goes back to this idea that we're an interpenetrating set of selves, and we tend to only hear from the verbal one. So there's all kinds of other ones in there that are competing and cooperating and everything else. And the other thing I can say about this, so that's more questions than answers, I guess. But the other thing that I think that's interesting is that you're right in the sense that the one kind of entity that we have direct experience with, which is the verbal, sort of one that presumably we share, is completely ignorant of most of the things that are going on there. And so the space that you're working with nicely coarse grains over all kinds of stuff, your liver function and everything else. You don't need to micromanage all that stuff. However, there are techniques that will add axes to your option space. So if you would like to learn to also consciously control your heart rate or your skin temperature or whatever, you can do biofeedback. There are tools that will enable you to cross that boundary, and you will now have a new axis in your option space that you never had before. Do you want it? I don't know. There's a good reason why most of these you don't use. It's good to sort of simplify your space. But there was a cool experiment where they measured the temperature between a rat's ears, and they gave it a reward proportional to the difference in temperature. And so rats readily learn to get their ears to I think like 5 degrees Celsius or something different between their ears to get the reward, right? So now that's amazing for a number of reasons. One is that now you've added an effector in your space that is kind of this physiological blood flow. I don't know how they do it, that you didn't have before. The other thing, of course, is the credit assignment. Here you are, you're a rat, and you just got some reward, and so, well, let me see, why did I get this? So, well, my tail is pointing up, and my left, fingers are clenched, and my whiskers are going. Which of those things actually were right? So this is, we still haven't cracked this in machine learning, is how living things are so good at figuring out what exactly they're being rewarded for a small number of trials, actually. So, but you can, I think you can break through, at least to some extent, and break through, and actually even further, right? So there are claims that certain types of mental practices will have effects on your immune system, for example, right? So I think you can go pretty far down, right, from if you wanted to add these kinds of things to your option space.
Interesting. Actually, just bouncing on that, that's really helpful, actually. I've not even thought about that, but that different parts of us ties in with, there's this big push all the time for you say about integrate. And actually when you scale out, because I do a lot of work with multi-service service providers, say in Africa or other countries where and you tend to find that any type of transdisciplinary project has the problem about whichever regime of attention or field of practice the voice is in at that time. And then when we talk about integrating, but it normally means they dominate. So what about configuring? So think about this idea of configuring different fields of practice, i.e. different ways or different ways of knowing, and also the other voices is strategic conversations with communities who don't normally get a voice, who know something in the state space beyond what the actors who've got a job in the agency know. And this sort of ties in a little bit with what you're talking about here. So I think it's quite interesting in the sense of, can we, because in a way, the biology isn't trying to integrate, it's actually configuring and allowing things to be, but it has a way to still know their different teleological spaces and either just let it get on with it or, knows where and when to get involved, I suppose, is the thing.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the one way of looking at that is to ask, what are the optimal policies for this binding? So I just I'll give you an example. So in the case of the multicellularity, we say, okay, individual cells are pretty cool, but when they connect via gap junctions into a multicellular collective, they can do these marvelous things, and they resist cancer, and turning off the connection and becoming becoming a cancer cell and going metastatic is bad. And so what you would really like to do is to reconnect these cells back in. So the thing is that tightly coupling individual units into a global entity avails you of all kinds of interesting things, right? So it raises the IQ of the whole and gives you all kinds of capabilities. Fine. But one of the things that gets lost when you do that is that the larger system now can dominate the goals of the lower system. And in fact, the larger system may have very little care for the goals or the welfare of the subunits. When was the last time you worried about all the skin cells you're shedding, right? You're going to do what you're going to do, and if you lose some skin cells, no problem. So what that suggests is that maximizing out this connectivity into some giant Borg-like thing is and obviously it's been it's kind of been attempted on on the social scale. We know how that turns out. So you want to somewhere in between there's an optimal policy, right? Where I hope, but there may not, maybe there's some no-go theorem. It's somewhere that says there is no good policy, but I hope that somewhere in there's a good policy that allows us to reap the rewards of appropriate kinds of large-scale organization without a sort of blanket collectivism that completely wipes out the needs of the lower level subunits. So that I hope is an empirical question that we should be looking for. What kind of policies give us that optimize the various things we want to optimize. Josh Bongard and I planned a grant at one point for this human flourishing program somewhere that I think it's actually an empirical question. Can we identify the optimal policies that preserve the needs of the subunits and reap the rewards of becoming a greater whole? Yeah, for sure. I mean, this in particular is interesting because I thought about this a little while ago that especially people who are interested in this kind of stuff, and you can think about the really old concept of group karma, right? This idea that not only you have your own individual cause and effect that you're causing, but in a strong sense, the group of which you are a part has its own right cause and effect that is as real as so that idea, and I don't know how many thousands of years old that idea is. I think it is an amazingly prescient, because in Western science, collective intelligence, right, the science of collective intelligence, and this idea that the group can be a swarm or whatever, can be an agent on its own, is relatively recent, right? That people have started taking that seriously in science. But I think that kind of thinking must have been extremely old, because there are these traditions that take it very seriously, that the group is not just a heap of stuff, but it actually has its own agency, in the sense that it can even be the subject of blame and reward, in the sense of like reward and punishment or karma or whatever. That's a very strong view of group agency that I think we've only scientifically we've only really appreciated recently. So I think that's pretty cool, actually.
Random linguistic thing here, that egregor, I was thinking about egregious, and like egregious in my mind is like out of bounds, but yet egregor is not that. It's the opposite. It's almost like a group thing. Maybe somebody else can think about that differently, but I thought that was an interesting conflict.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, and so two thoughts about that. One is that this goes back to this idea of spaces and the different spaces that each of the subunits is working in. One way that and after I drew this cone and I realized that it kind of looked like the special relativity cone and all that, some other pieces of relativity sort of started popping into my head, and this idea of deforming the space around you, right? So if you're a mass, you deform the space around you, which in turn alters your next possible movements and the possible movements of the other masses around you, right? So by deforming that, by your actions, you are deforming the possibility space for yourself, for things next to you, for your components, and so on. And so one thing that I think happens is that these larger systems deform the action space for their lower systems, so that all they have to do is roll downhill in effect. And so if you zoom in, so this gets back, and I'm going to connect this back to your point about karma and action and choices and so on. When you zoom in, all you see is physics, and you say, oh, well, this is just, well, of course that's what it's doing. That's all it could do. All the gradients are pointing this way. That's what it had to do. But the reason it can do that is and still get to some global goal is because the higher level system has already deformed that space. So I see this, and I don't know how I'm going to ever draw this. That's a different story. But I see all these different levels as deforming their simpler space that they're working in, which then changes the option space for their subunits so that they don't have to be as smart. This is sort of Dennett's idea of progressively dumber robots all the way down. That works if each system makes it so that the lower level systems don't have to do quite as much of the work. And there's a stupid example I always go to from like common everyday life. If you ever had a friend who tried to stop smoking and they like to smoke at night, one of the things they might do is put their car keys somewhere that's really hard to get to. Why? Because they know that when they at midnight when they want to smoke, they're not going to feel like going hunting for the keys, and then they could find it, and then that's that. So what they're doing is, and now who are you doing this to? You're doing this to your future self, right? You're deforming the space for your future self, in that case consciously, and of course we all do things unconsciously too, but in that case you're consciously deforming the action space for your future self in order to so that you can be on autopilot at that point, right? You don't have to have the willpower at midnight that I'm going to not do this. Somebody's already sort of twisted the space for you so that just going to get your keys is just too high of a barrier and forget it. So right, so I think that deformation of these action spaces is a really important way in which lower and higher level systems relate. The lower level systems simplify the action space for the higher level system because they're competent, so the higher level system doesn't need all the dimensions, and the higher system bends the space of the lower system to make things easier to get to. And that goes back to your other point that you just made about in the moment of taking actions in the moment that are the consequence of all the pressures that you have set up and other things have set up for you. Where, yeah, I see this as, so if we think about will in the sense of free will or decision making or whatever, I see this again, this like four-dimensional block where each one of us at any point in time is a slice of it, and if you zoom in on that one, that selflet that exists at that one time slice, your free will, so to speak, is limited to none, because at that moment on the local scale, you are going to do whatever the local forces have arranged that you're going to do, right? And this is one, like a simple example is, can you control what your next thought is going to be? You really can't. Your next thought is going to be whatever it is. So at the local level, when you zoom in, there's no useful sense of freedom there. However, if you zoom out on the long scale, what is true, I think, is that you can take actions, repeated actions, whether they be practice or whatever they're going to be. You can take repeated actions that alter your cognitive causal structure so that over time you have made changes. And so no, you can't control the next thought you're going to have now, but you can control what percentage of your thoughts are negative or whatever it is down the line, right? So to me, that question of choice and freedom is very much relative to what scale you're asking about. If you zoom in to the low, to the physics and the sort of short time scale, no, I don't think there's any useful sense of that. But over the long term, absolutely, because you can make changes both in your environment, your own structure, that will get you to a different place.
Yeah, this is really helpful actually to hear it thought about this way. And just as we were saying there about this sort of almost transcendental, or the way we often think of things being excluded, egregious, as Sarah was saying, and when we need to move beyond the inner outer, there's an inner thought process and there's an outer world, but the two are linked, like we say. So with active inference, the idea is that I don't necessarily purely have a model of those cones in my head. But I've got an action model for how to draw them. I haven't got the whole thing that can be dumped down like a data source, but I have a way to do that, which sort of ties in. And and when you mentioned there about looking at the future, one thing that adds that active inference hasn't really done is it sort of talks about, say, the car keys example is the sequence at which something might have to happen to get to the future being disrupted, which is kind of that quantum contextuality idea. Whereas normally in active inference, they talk about the niche construction or the niche modification, but it's not just about modifying itself, it's modifying the trajectories you might take through that niche, which that gives you more near time possibilities for like sculpting what can happen when it can happen. So that, I think that's quite useful. And I was wondering how you see that relationship to niche construction and whether and models being sort of embedded in the world, i.e., so if systems are really models in the world that we then read or interact with using our structures, how do we link up that kind of cone with the kind of niche construction that's maybe being used in other areas of active inference?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a very difficult question. I can sort of address a small part of it, I think, at this point, and I can, I think one of the key questions of all of this is to what extent. When we look at systems and we see the dimensions with, let's just do the third person case first, and then we'll talk about the first person case that you're talking about. So when we look at a system and we make a map of its problem solving in some space and its goal directed activity in some space, the question is that in any sense objective? Meaning could we make a case that model of that space is better or the best, or is there an infinity of ways to look at it? And in particular, how does that relate to now the first person perspective of that system itself? What does the space look like? It's a little bit like the whole Umwelt thing, right? Where you're sort of in some space. What does it look like to you? And Chris Fields made a really nice example in our computational meeting a couple of weeks ago, where he said, imagine a bacterium, and there's some sugar gradient that the bacterium is in, and it's it wants to have more energy. So now one thing we are tempted to do is to draw a space where by rotating its flagella and whatever else, this thing is going to move up the gradient. But there's something else it can do, which is that it can turn on a gene for an enzyme that lets it use a completely different sugar, or let it use that sugar better, or something else that solves that same problem with an effector that to us is an entirely different space. So we look at this and we say, that solution has a problem in physical space, and it has a solution in transcriptional space. If you're a bacterium, is there any sense in which those are not part of the same space? I mean, I have no idea what it's like to be that bacterium. One could make an argument that our dissection of these things as two different spaces is totally biased, because we're scientists, that's how we like to look at things, that to the bacterium, both of those are effectors that live together. That's kind of a mix. It's almost like it's almost like you can ask about some sort of PCA, right? If you have principal component analysis, where you're learning about your world and you're going to end up with a picture of what the axes are that don't necessarily make any sense to us looking at the system, right? You get these components that these control knobs, and we look at it and say, what the hell is what is it doing? Well, but to the system, those are efficient ways to build an axis. And people like Robert Prentner and Don Hoffman have these models of these cognitive systems from scratch, sort of building these worlds, these virtual spaces for themselves, right? That you don't actually know what spaces you're in. So I think there's a research agenda there, which is, can we build some sort of appliance, meaning some sort of, I don't know, machine learning thing or something that will try to extract these in a, I'm not going to say unbiased, but at least unsupervised manner. That can we build an agency detector? Can we build something that looks at a system and says, I tell you what, if you assume this axis, and this axis, then I can paint you a really efficient search strategy that will allow you to predict what the system is going to do next, because you can view this as problem solving in this space, right? And maybe it generates a palette of solutions like that, and there's one that's head and shoulders above the others, and you say, fine, that's my scientific theory of what's going on here, and maybe right, and maybe that works. I don't know. So that's a research kind of agenda for the future. And the other cool thing about that is, if you do that, of course, one thing you might want to do is then build a more sophisticated synthetic intelligence by sticking that thing, basically closing the loop and sticking that module inside the agent itself. And here's why I'm saying that. All animals, I think, at least past a certain point, certainly have agency detectors. This is why we love our visual systems, love symmetry and so on, because you really want to know, looking out into the world, you really want to know what are the passive elements and what are the other agents that might eat you, that you might communicate with, that you might convince them to do something else. Right? So we are constantly estimating, theory of mind, right, an agency for all the things we're looking at, because that helps you get around. You need to know if it's a rock, or if it's something that's just going to come eat you no matter what, or if it's a conspecific that you might actually lie to and have a relationship, or whatever you're going to do, some sort of complicated interaction, right? So we're all trying to gauge that. And probably what one of the things that kind of module also does is turn inwards to tell you stories about yourself. And the reason we know that exists is because of confabulation. So just as a simple example, as this is a modern, there are older examples from the split brain studies, but the modern example, there's somebody who's got an electrode, and this is an actual experiment that was done. He had epilepsy or something, and they put an electrode in their brain, in his brain, and it happened to land in an area that, when you stimulate it, it stimulates laughter. The person just starts laughing, right? So you're sitting there. So this person is sitting there talking to, they're having a serious conversation with the doctor. Somebody off scene pushes the button. Person starts laughing. The doctor says to him, "Why are you laughing?" 0% of the time, the answer is, "Geez, I don't know. That was super weird. I was all serious, and suddenly my mouth starts laughing." That never happens. What happens is the person says, "Oh, I came up with a funny story, and I was just thinking of a funny thing that happened." Right? So what happens is, and this has been, I'm not the first person to point this out, that we are massively unaware of lots of stuff that goes on in there. And we have a module, apparently, whose job it is to tell coherent stories about what that all adds up to. So not just turning outwards to see what kind of agents we see out there, but actually to look inwards and come up with plausible explanations that, no, you're not an automaton because somebody pushed a button. That's not a preferred explanation. The preferred explanation is, you're an agent, you come up with funny stories, and sometimes they made you laugh. That's a better explanation. So we have this. So if we had such a thing, we could imagine already, piece by piece, starting to put this together into what might be a fairly sophisticated cognitive system that has a bit of metacognition and a bit of much like all of us, sort of faulty access to what it is that we're doing, and all these kinds of interesting things. Yeah, totally possible. And so for sure, I'm not going to try to make the argument that we have a mature theory of free will of that kind. I don't think we do. But and I think you're absolutely right in that is in fact a really critical point. If your freedom in each slice is zero, then many times zero, it's still zero, right? So totally true. I think we can make two moves, and again, this is super early. I'm not claiming this is in any way going to survive. Careful thought into the future. I think we can make two shifts. One shift is that I think it's again, and I'm like a broken record with this stuff, but I think that binary. This binary distinction between you have freedom or you do not, I think that's wrong. So I think what you have, it goes by amounts. So you may have very little. If you're a mechanical clock, you have very little, and if you're some other type of living thing, you may have more, and then you may have more than that. So then what you have is, and this is super amateurish, but just to kind of visualize. What I see is the kind of addition that you get in calculus, where you start with extremely tiny things that are kind of zero, but not really, and eventually they add up to something, right? That's how I see it. That's how I think that what you have at each point is a teeny tiny amount, and if you look close, basically it's an epsilon that's not worth talking about. It's basically you don't have any. But it isn't quite zero, and over time, that mental effort, whatever that is, that you put into working on your free will or on your kindness or whatever you're working on, over time, it integrates into an area, even though you're integrating infinitely thin strips. Like that's the vision that I have in my head, that if we just do away with the fact that it's actually zero, that I don't think it's actually zero, then you can build up something over time, and you can magnify it. And if I'll say one more thing, which if we're gonna abuse physics like this, right? Which I realize this is all like completely informal and whatever. If we're gonna abuse it, I'll make one more analogy. If you think about what is what is a minimal level of agency? So sometimes people ask me like, well, is there a zero on your continuum, right? Is there an actual zero? And like, what's the minimal? What is the smallest? And so I think, okay, if you're going to design the absolute minimal piece that still has some non-zero agency, what does it need? I feel like it needs two things. It needs some minimal amount of decision-making that isn't obviously caused by local causes, right? It needs at least something that reaches outward in terms of space or time or complexity, or something that isn't obviously a locally determined necessity. That's one. And the second thing it needs is some amount of goal-directed activity, something that looks like a goal-directed activity. So once you've said that, it seems to me that individual particles already have this, right? Because quantum indeterminacy gives you the first one, and least action principles give you the second one. So you've already got that. And so now so I think, and again, this is amateurish as far as the physics goes, but my gut feeling is that there isn't a zero, that you already start with some minimal amount, and now you can do one of two things. You got these particles. You can do one of two things. You can make a rock out of them. So you aggregate them in one way, which basically gets rid of all those nice properties, and it ends up having very low agency. It just aggregates all of it in a way that doesn't do anything useful. Or if you're alive, you can amplify those properties and end up further down on the continuum. So that's kind of my fuzzy story at the moment, is that I think we start off at non-zero, and then you can either stay there if you don't have the right organization, or you can amplify the hell out of it and get to be more agential.
No, my head is sufficiently exploded.
Yeah, no, I think that was a nice. I mean, I think there's a lot to think about because we've covered an awful lot of territory. But I think it's. I was interesting to see that you're bringing the thingness, and that I know Carl Friston talks about that. So I suppose one last bit would be: would you call yourself a non-dual monist in the way that Carl sort of talks about that idea, or is that something a bit different, or maybe not even relevant in this context?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I hesitate to put a name on it for two reasons. Number one, everything that we've talked about so far has been very much from a functional third person perspective. So we haven't really touched the so-called hard problem of consciousness or what so in order, and the thing is, nothing that I've said touches this question of why is it like to be something that's one of these systems, right? So from that perspective, assuming that we believe, I mean, some people, will say that that's a non-problem and that there is no such thing and whatever, but I'm not 100% convinced of that actually. And so there are that I do think there's a hard problem, and I don't have anything that addresses it. And so I don't know, what camp that puts me in. The other thing is that I have a lot of sort of kind of panpsychist sympathies in the following way. So I think that if you scale down, so one reason people don't like panpsychism is like it means that you think that rocks have hopes and dreams like the rest of us. Okay, so that's obviously not what I'm saying. The reason people go to that extreme is because they've scaled down the structures that are needed for agency, but they haven't scaled down the expectation. So yes, it's silly to think that rocks have the same hopes and dreams that we do. However, if you scale both sides of the equation, I'm not at all sure why. Again, if you're not into binary classifications, it is conscious or it's not. That I think is definitely wrong. So if phenomenal consciousness is a kind of continuum too, I don't see any reason why there couldn't be a tiny bit of something that's super hard for us to imagine because we're used to a much bigger level of perception and consciousness that isn't associated with a lot of other systems that we normally that people who normally work in cognitive science would never buy as having consciousness. So I have a lot of kind of sympathies on that front, mainly because I don't buy this binary distinction. And we could talk about this actually interesting. And I'll tell you why. Basically, bioengineering and the kinds of things that are possible now they are really dissolving a lot of things that seem to be sharp categories before. And I'm not even sure at this point that the distinction between first person and third person knowledge is even sharp. And I'll just draw you a simple picture. And I preface this by saying I made a picture of this and I sent it to a well-known philosopher, and he said it was horrible and not useful. But we'll see what you think. Imagine that you're looking at there's a brain and there's some electrophysiology being done, some electrodes stuck in there, and it's being processed. And you're on the outside. You're the scientist. You're on the outside. You're looking at that data. Uncontroversially, third person, right? You have no idea what it's like to be that subject. You are studying some signals that come off of that. Fine. Now, what we do is we change the scenario a little bit, and what we do is we take some of those interfaces that they have these interfaces for the blind that either go on your tongue or they go sometimes in your retina, but basically they turn camera signals into something that's directly plugged into your brain with electrodes. Okay, so now we take that setup, and instead of the camera, we plug it directly into the electrophysiology apparatus. So now what you're receiving a heavily processed signal, but it's coming directly from that brain into your brain. And what's interesting is that people who use these kind of sensory augmentation devices, they will eventually report that it's just like seeing. They learn to get around, like the electric lollipop is this thing you stick on your tongue, and it shocks your tongue in a way that maps onto the pixels of a camera, right? And they say, oh, it's just like seeing it. So okay, so now you've moved. So it's like it's sort of, third person, but, it's maybe like 2.5 person or something. And then you can do another experiment. You can say, well, what we're going to do is, instead of using all this, heavily, all this electronics and processing in between, we're just going to connect the brains. And we can do this. And the reason we know we can do this is that there are conjoined twins whose brains are in fact connected, so that there's no, sort of clumsy electronic interface in the middle. The brains are directly connected. And so now you say, okay, so if my brain is now connected to this other person having the experience, it's sort of, is that still third person? And then you ask the question, yeah, but in your own brain, so some people say, that's an aberrant, that's an aberrant case. But in your own brain, you've got pieces of the brain that have to talk to each other. You're not an indivisible monad of some type, right? You are a bunch of pieces that also have to talk to each other. So the left side has to talk to the right side. In fact, the front talks to the brain. You are anyway pieces of the brain having to talk to each other. And somehow that ends up being first person. So now what we've just done is built a continuum where you can smoothly, and we can fill in anywhere between these two systems. I can fill in as sort of finely as you want. And you can smoothly move from first person experience to third person as science, because the bioengineering tells you that you can do it. So I'm not even sure that's a distinction. So it's hard to say. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Wow, I was going to ask one question. Now I'm going to ask another one. This makes me think, related to coarse screening, related to layers and levels of different organisms, like it just, the kind of example you just laid out, makes me question whether you can even stratify in that way, or whether it makes sense to stratify in that way. But let me go back to something we didn't cover, and I heard it on your podcast, and you ended with a question related to moral philosophy, or ethics, I guess. I don't know the distinction there, but
yeah.
When, if you're coming from the perspective of not believing in a binary between, you said it better than I did, living, non-living, whatever, like agent versus not. And then you're making things like xenobots. It's like that kind of, if you held those two views of not believing in the binary, then it seems like there really wouldn't be an ethical question. And so I'm wondering where your thinking is along that.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely an ethical question, and I think it's not quite what we think it is, and I'll tell you what it is. But let's just take a step back. So long before anybody made xenobots, we made humans, right? The old-fashioned way. And so this is like, then it's competence without comprehension, right? So we have no idea how it worked, but for hundreds of thousands of years, we made other humans, and so we take care of them as best we can most of the time, sometimes not really very well, so we already did that. Then we make all sorts of animals in terms of food production and other things. We make hybrids, so we make mules that are animals that never existed before, right? We've made new plants. So the first thing that's really critical, and often the reason I'm sort of sensitized to all this is that people always say, "Oh my God, you're making xenobots. It's a new," like let's not forget what we've already been doing, right? And let's be super clear that there's a massive problem with the food industry, right? Long before we get to worrying about xenobots, there's all kinds of things that we need to fix. So I just want to be, I kind of want to be clear that we've already been making animals, and in fact other humans, for which we sometimes take good responsibility and sometimes we don't. I think this is absolutely raises an ethical problem, and the ethical problem is the following: when we go to synthetic biology and bioengineering kinds of seminars, there's usually now a session that's about ethics, and the session goes like this. Somebody will show a brain organoid made of human cells, and someone will say, "Oh my God, that you shouldn't be doing that." And somebody else will say, "Well, let's just see how much like a human brain it is." And then people spend a couple hours arguing about whether it is or is not enough like a human brain that they need to worry about it. And maybe they end up saying it's fine, or maybe they end up saying it's not fine, whatever. I think the much bigger issue is that whether or not something looks anything like a human brain is a very poor guide to how much you need to worry about it. And in the past, the way that we would figure out whether or not how much moral responsibility we had for a particular system went roughly like this. You would sort of look at it, and if it was squishy and warm and furry, you would say, yeah. And if it was metallic and it came from an assembly line, you'd say, do what you want, no problem, right? So two things used to be a guide, and even that we didn't do so well, obviously with those principles, but two things that used to be a guide were, where did it come from? Did it evolve, or was it designed? And what is it made of? And it was and that was pretty good, right? You could, because if it was evolved, you could look on the sort of the tree of life, and you could say, it's a worm, we don't need to fill out any forms when we do these experiments. Or you could say, it's a frog, I need to fill out a lot of forms before we can do experiments, right? For that, then that's in fact how it works. Because you know something about that lineage, and you make some sort of guesses about where things are. And then if it's an octopus, people really don't know what to do, and so on. All of that is going completely out the window, right? So in the next I don't know, couple of decades, we are going to be surrounded by, and this is another thing that I'm writing on, the option space of possible creatures. We're talking about hybrids, cyborgs, hybrids. There's a million different ways to recombine evolved, designed, living, non-living, and software agents into new forms that have never existed before. So what something looks like is no guide to what the cognition is. Where it came from, meaning evolved or designed, is going to be a bad question, because half of the stuff we're building with is now evolved, and so on. All of the things, it's just a machine versus, it's a nice mammal. All of that stuff is going to go out the window. So to me, the ethical problem is much bigger than just asking about whether something's like a human brain. What we really are going to need is a new ethical system for learning how to deal with agents that look nothing like us, and that don't look like anything we've ever seen before, and yet are going to have all sorts of cognitive capacities. And we have to let go of categories like machine, like robot, like all these other things that really don't mean anything. They never did, but it was fine in the past. It's no longer going to be useful. And that's the ethical problem. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, this was really fun. Yeah, great discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye.